80% of veterans would like to return to their home of record after they enlist, and less than 30% do. So wouldn't it be great? So instead of telling someone, hey, take the highest dollar value possible for a W-2 company, move anywhere in the United States and start your family over with another permanent change of station, instead saying, move back home and take those millions of dollars of taxpayer leadership that you've been given and pour it into a community where you have exponential impact.
Welcome to Warrior Money, the show devoted to supporting our brothers and sisters veterans and our military troops. I'm Patrick Murphy.
And I'm Dan Coons.
Today, we're joined by Patrick Flood, an Army Green Beret, combat decorated, 100% disabled veteran, and the founder of Owners in Honor, a nonprofit that's dedicated to helping veterans step into business ownership and build new legacies for their families and their teams. Between his military leadership and his entrepreneurial drive, Patrick's story shows how purpose after service can look powerful and purposeful. All right, Patrick Flood, welcome to Warrior Money, my friend.
Yeah, thanks again for having me, guys.
Yeah, all right, so we always start off bluff, bottom line up front. What's the one piece of advice that you give the veterans who want to become entrepreneurs?
I would suggest, so whenever you're becoming an entrepreneur, I think something that's maybe lost on some people is that you're building an asset. And so understanding that you're building an asset and that you eventually are going to leave that asset to somebody else. So understanding what your long-term vision is for the asset, very similar to military planning, what's the vision, and then trying to be able to achieve that vision, which helps us, I think those of us who are veterans, be able to do some backwards planning and then make some very good risk calculations to be able to then make decisions that are put us in the path of purpose.
You know, it's oftentimes we get in here and we hear something for the first time, but it like aligns spiritually to like where, like spiritually, philosophically, professionally, whatever it is, to like where we think things are. I've never heard anybody say that you build a business as though it's an asset to be transferred over. Where it is, I believe that I agree with that wholeheartedly, and establishing trust for your family and doing all those things from a legacy asset. Where does that, how did you think through that, or where did that come into play as the best advice that you've given? Like, where does that thought process come from?
So it's interesting. So I think when I first started out, the concept of the nonprofit, I thought really mostly about veterans finding a different pathway post-transition that was less volatile than startup entrepreneurship. Because there's a lot of veterans who are interested in entrepreneurship. It just didn't seem like a lot of them were educated about the path of business ownership instead. And so while you never want to quell that fire that the startup entrepreneur has, you never want to tell them not to do it, because if that were the case, we wouldn't have Uber, we wouldn't have, a lot of great new products. At the same time, there's a lot of people, post World War II, there was over 40%, 50% of businesses almost that were veteran owned. Now it's 5%. And a lot of those businesses weren't just startups. They were generational businesses that you came back from combat, you took over your father's business or your family's business, and you continue to run it. And I think there's an opportunity there to be able to find that. What it really comes down to, though, is that when I started doing, now that we're into year 3 of really kind of developing it and actually acting on it, is that the origin story, and this is part of the gift of the Bush Center and being able to really identify what the nugget is that drew you to what it is that our missions are to help veterans. And really what it comes down to is my dad. So my dad was a corpsman and then a PA. He served for 26 total years in both the active Navy and then also as a reservist in the Army. And he built a business. He bought a clinic, built a clinic, and then ran it for over 20 years, but he was in the community for 40. And when he was selling the business, it was because my younger brother had committed suicide, and which is one of the top 3 reasons people leave businesses. And in that, he didn't have a network of people to be able to help him sell the business. And so went to a family attorney, had the family attorney prepare documentation, went to 3 competitors essentially to sell it to competitors, one of which was backed by a private equity fund that had M&A attorneys. And so he had a family attorney against 2 M&A attorneys. Ended up selling the business for the value of the property and not for the value of the business. And I didn't understand that until I was at business school. And then I started thinking about what is it that I'm trying to do, is that there's a tremendous amount of people, veteran entrepreneurs, and this is why I think it's the most important thing, is that they run the business because it's providing them financial well-being for their families and being able for them to be able to commit to the community similar to the way they committed to the country. The challenge is that very few technicians, and the national average is that less than 85% of businesses have any exit plan. And so
Yeah.
the tendency is that a technician runs the business because that's what he does and that's their identity. They don't consider the fact that they're going to have to transition it at some point. And so when they do, there's a one time in their life event that if they don't have a stable of people that they can rely on and be able to talk to, it's a very sharky environment because a lot of people do this for a living. And so they do it hundreds of times.
Yeah.
So they can talk to a business owner in a way like they did to my dad, where he thought that he was getting a great deal because he was getting 3 times his annual salary. But the reality is he was getting a fifth of the value of the business.
Yeah.
So for that, one, it's connecting both things. So one is to be able to identify the fact that you're buying a business or building a business to create an asset, to be able to sell that or transfer that asset. The most expensive part of running a business is selling it. The second part is, for veterans, a great way to be able to transfer that business, especially if it's a veteran-owned business that has certifications, is to be able to transfer it to another veteran. Well, quite frankly, there aren't enough people in the United States to be able to accept all the businesses that are going to be transferred in the next 5 years. Wouldn't it be great if we actually prepared veterans in a special way to be able to do so? And in a way that, I'm a Green Beret that is just like us building the auxiliary and determining that in these communities, we are creating community entities that are human beings that are able to 80% of veterans would like to return to their home of record after they enlist, and less than 30% do. So wouldn't it be great? So instead of telling someone, hey, take the highest dollar value possible for a W-2 company, move anywhere in the United States and start your family over with another permanent change of station, instead saying, move back home and take those millions of dollars of taxpayer leadership that you've been given and pour it into a community where you have exponential impact. And I think that's the thing. And Patrick, you talk about this a lot. That's part of it, is the business ownership of veterans post-World War II. The other part is based on that business ownership and the foundation of capitalism, them being able to invest in their communities and grow parks and, community events and paying for the baseball
civic assets. Right.
Yeah,
Right.
civic assets.
So, Patrick, let me real quick, because I want to talk about, every year we have 200,000 veterans, active troops who become veterans. Every year there's 600,000 small businesses that basically fail. So you're saying, hey, why not have a succession plan? Why not get veterans to fall in these companies? But before we get there, you have such a unique story. And I just want, if I'm a, sergeant first class, or I'm, transitioning out, et cetera, your career, 26 years in the Army, 22 years, though, in Special Forces, Green Beret. And then when you're in the middle of battalion command, you go to Duke Business School. Walk us through that purpose-driven life that you started, following your dad's footsteps as a Navy corpsman, and then, how you got to this next chapter.
Yeah, so for me, I think a lot of it comes from being the child of a Mustang. So, I always valued really both sides of the coin of the military community, whether it's in the enlisted side or the officer side. And I think there's values to either one. My grandfathers, one of which was an officer in the Navy during World War II. The other one was a enlisted mechanic on B-19s. So, I'm a and they're both first generation Americans. So I'm a third generation American on both sides, Irish like you are. And I just never thought that I would do anything different. And I've really felt growing up, because of our family's trip to the United States happened to do with being the third side in the Irish Civil War. So coming to a country that really gave us a chance to start over. And it was always part of my family's fabric. My dad's one of 9 kids. Every child within my dad's family either became a teacher, a psychologist, or served in the military in some way. So everyone had a very servant mindset. And for me, I think I just always assumed that I would serve in some capacity. And, my parents weren't doing super well financially when I was in high school. And so my brother went to West Point, which is great because there's no way he would have been able to go to a college that was that good without putting my parents financially into underwater.
Yeah, that's a free
And
$250,000 education at least. Right.
yeah, like crazy. And so, and then I took I took the easier way out, which is because I wanted to learn how to do my laundry. And so I took an ROTC scholarship and ended up going to George Washington University, also a very good school, that was fully funded by an Army ROTC scholarship. And I didn't do great my first year of school because I went from a community of 300 people in rural Wisconsin to a fairly large city with a lot of stuff going on. I was an honors student in high school, but we didn't have AP courses, so I was repeating a lot of the same courses, and then didn't do that great. And so my solution was I was going to drop out of school and join the Navy, and actually had a delayed enlistment.
Hmm.
And my dad, because he was in the reserves at the time as a PA, did a rotation at Walter Reed, and he and my professor of military science sat down and showed me math. And based on the math of me coming, enlisting and then getting at the time, the Montgomery GI Bill and trying to go back to a college as good as George Washington, the chances of that were pretty low. And so I buckled down, took summer school, did everything I needed to do, and got commissioned as an armor officer in the United States Army.
Yeah,
I love that.
that's an awesome story.
Yeah. Dad was actually an army officer as well.
Yeah.
But I tell you what, Patrick, we're going to take a quick break, right? And we're going to come right back. More about your story and Owners in Honor when we get back next on Warrior Money. All right, welcome back. Patrick Flood is here to walk us through how veterans can lead again, this time in business ownership, requiring existing companies to leveraging their veteran strengths in the boardroom. We're going to unpack his path and what you could do.
We'll also focus on what veteran entrepreneurs need to know about financing, buying a business rather than starting from scratch, and turning service into leadership in the civilian world. Patrick, welcome back to Warrior Money.
Yeah, thanks again.
Hey, we talk a whole heck of a lot on this show about how hard it is to transition to find purpose. Like, it is a really, really probably the most underlying conversation we have here is about actually how do we find purpose post service, right? I heard a lot of purpose in your story about your dad and your family and where that came from. When we're thinking about business ownership for transitioning veterans, how do they find or align themselves to a purpose? And then how do you align that purpose with capital to actually go out and do that? Like, there's a huge bridge there that I think people really struggle with traveling on.
Yeah, so one of the benefits of entrepreneurship in general, whether that's startup or acquisition entrepreneurship, is the fact that you have much more autonomy. So I think a lot of us, when we leave the military, even though the military is a big bureaucracy and it feels like there's a lot of rules, we get out and we work in the civilian sector and we're making money. Like, I made great money the first 3 years I was out. I just didn't feel fulfilled. And maybe I needed to make the money to realize that it wasn't about the money.
That's a good point.
That for me, it was more about helping people solve problems. So it's all the leadership, mentorship, and coaching that we talk about quite a bit in the military, and where when you go into small business ownership, that's what it is. I mean, they're all, unless you get, into an e-commerce business, typically speaking, they're very human-centered businesses. You have human customers, human suppliers, human employees, and human community that you need to deal with, that have human lawmakers that are going to affect what it is that you're doing. So all of those things end up becoming very familiar, I think, to what we do within the military, which is really manage expectations, help people manage risk, and communicate with human beings to be able to motivate them to do something that maybe they couldn't imagine doing on their own.
Yeah.
And so what's interesting about that is that there's that combined with what I spoke about earlier, is now you're doing it instead of for, a Fortune 500 company, which is going to make a difference because veterans make a difference in every company they work in. You're potentially doing it in the town you grew up in. And so now, as a former recruiting battalion commander, I could tell you, I would love that story.
Yeah.
Because then instead of having 300 recruiters, I have 30,000. And, I have people coming back and telling their great story. They served 2 years, 3 years, doesn't matter to me. 20 years, you come back, great customer service experience, met people, got educated, got the post 9/11 GI Bill. and then they contribute back to the community they came from, especially, folks that maybe straighten out their life based on the fact that they had, discipline, but also people that had a great deal of love for them, sometimes for the first time in their life. And so being able
Mm.
to connect all that stuff for a veteran and get them back home too, I think is a big deal.
Yeah, Patrick, you mentioned basically, America is a land of opportunity, and Dan and I are both hockey players, right? So, one of the greatest players ever was Wayne Gretzky. He said, I got past the puck where people are going to be, not where they are now, right? And so, what's fascinating, what you're doing, and Dan and I agree on this, is the fact that 40% of the small businesses out there are owned right now by baby boomers, right? And they're about to retire.
Right.
So, to say to, the 200,000 plus active troops who are going to become veterans, hey, listen, you can go and get ownership through acquisition. You look at Walmart, started by Sam Walton. He was 41 when he led Walmart. But how does that work? Tell us about Owners in Honor.
Yeah, so for us, we really provide three different components. One is education, the other one is advisory services, and then the last one is community. So there's three main reasons that businesses aren't profitable or quote unquote fail within 3 to 5 years after acquisition. Number one is poor acquisition. So it's not understanding what you're getting involved in the business, not understanding yourself, which is a big part, not understanding your vision or your financial horizon. So you over acquire, take on too much risk, don't have enough capability to be able to do the M&A or mergers and acquisitions diligence, et cetera. Second part is not having enough experience, so lack of experience. So in that, if you are provided advisory services similar to, as a Green Beret, if I would have taken 300 commanders to the target and only brought back 100, it wouldn't have been a great day for us. And so for us, it's that, okay, we need to do a little bit more and maybe go with them in order to make sure that there's a higher success rate for the people that are doing it. Do we think that we're going to be with someone forever? We have a contract that we sign with them that they can be with us for 10 years, but our goal is for them to really not need us after the first 5 so that they could do whatever they need to do on their own. And then we're sort of on the sideline being able to provide mentorship. And then they in turn turn into mentors themselves. And then lastly, it's the community. So connecting both to the CEO circle and IBMF. So something that's already established to veteran-owned business owners, but then also every person who goes through the system signs a contract that they will in turn be a mentor to someone else in the program. So it ends up being ideally very much like the military, where
Yeah.
you move up and then you move in a circle and eventually you're the person mentoring the person coming up behind you, which is, I think, the other thing that some of us miss when we go into the corporate sector is that it is not usual for a corporation to be able to train your replacement. I think it's very, there's a lot of friction in there because you don't necessarily know that you're moving up to the next step. So you don't want to invest, I think, quite as much in the people that are working for you to be able to take your job. Whereas in the military, it's just what we do. And in small business, it's just what you do because you don't have that many people. And so that's great. And then for us, it's that any veteran who has a general discharge or better, that can prove it with a DD-214, a military spouse or a Gold Star family member can apply to the program. They go through different various modules to then prepare them to do an acquisition. And then the last of those modules is called, and those are really asynchronous. So it's not in a cohort, and it's really self-timed. It's very similar to those of us who are familiar with like CLEP, CLEP learning, where you did, box of books or you did stuff online where it's, web generated. Right now it's mostly manual, so it's individual counseling.
Yep.
But that'll get you to the point then you do a buy box exercise, which is really mitigating that first risk of understanding your acquisition by understanding what you're looking for. Super helpful to bankers and also to brokers to be able to help you buy a business instead of saying, hey, I'm a veteran, I'd like to buy a business, I need to make $150,000 a year anywhere in the country. Imagine if you needed to buy a house and that's the message you sent to your real estate agent, you wouldn't get a whole heck of a lot of help.
Yeah.
And so it's
Very
better
helpful.
for us to be able to say, hey,
Right.
I want to live in Houston, I want to live in Philly, I want to live in whatever, I want to live in East Tennessee. Well, that's great. So our recommendation is for you to get a job, use this as sort of an EMBA, understand that there's going to be a light at the end of the tunnel with that job. So if you feel like maybe you're underemployed or maybe you're not completely fulfilled with whatever you're doing right out, you're working on something to move to whatever is next, which is also very familiar for those of us who are veterans who have done, your typical operational role followed by a staff role. Is that during the staff role, you're paying your penance for, being in an operational role. And then you realize how important those staff roles are only once you serve in it. And then as an operator, you're like, okay, I give a lot more grace to the people in staff, and maybe it's not always their problem. And so that's great. It's very familiar to what we're used to. It. Then once you then acquire the business, you get a small business advisor and executive coach for up to 5 years. And then once you start to look for exiting, there's an education platform that you're going to get to help you do exit and succession planning. And then we introduce you to vetted advisors that are going to provide, specific discounts to veterans that go through our program to then make sure they get all the advice possible to get them the highest valuation possible for their businesses when they exit. Ideally, to sell to a veteran, but worst case scenario, they get the highest valuation possible, and then they create family wealth, which is also great.
Yep, that's great. Hey, we've got a common friend from a person we work with, Dave Kluge, and you mentioned kind of mini EMBA, and you also talked a little bit earlier about the Duke program. Can you talk about how your personal military veteran network has kind of helped you and influenced your professional development? And never mind the owners and operators. Tell me how your network has helped you through your transitions.
Yeah, so I had the opportunity in like 2009 to go to grad school at Naval Postgraduate School with Dave, and Dave was about 6 months ahead of me because it's an 18-month program. And so he was so I went a little bit early because I'd been injured pretty badly when I was in seventh group. And so I went a little bit early because I was trying to fight a med board and stay in the Army, but at
Yeah.
the same time wanted to, which, I think it was a good idea. But it ended up actually working out pretty great. And so talked to Dave. Dave ended up getting a battalion. He got a recruiting battalion like I eventually got. And when, he and I had stayed friends, even though he served in a different group than I did. And when I was going into battalion, I was like, hey, what was the advice that you would give someone who would have your job? And he said, go to business school. He goes, generally, all of the recruiting battalions are in major metropolitan areas, and you could probably either find one that's local to that major metropolitan area, or you could find one that's like a weekend MBA program or an EMBA program, but make sure you get one that provides you the same degree so you don't get that sort of asterisk behind your degree. So I was like, all right. So in that, I was in DC at the time, served in the State Department for the SOCOM, and Duke was one of the programs. There was a gentleman who, super good dude, Rich Sexton, who had been my ops officer when I was serving under the ambassador in Peru. And he had gotten out before me, and I had written him a recommendation as a supervisor to go into Duke. So he ended up writing me a recommendation as an alumni so that I could get in, and I got in the program. And it was a lot of work, for those 18 months, because there was probably a year of overlap when I was both going to school. But it's interesting, and what Dave told me is true, is that, it was the first time in a long time that I'd been non-deployable. And in that, and for those of anybody who's listening to the podcast, when you're in the military and your battalion commander doesn't have his leave lined up really well, it creates chaos to the entire battalion because the XO doesn't know when he can take leave. That means the 3 doesn't know, which means the company commanders don't know, which means in our case, station commanders don't know. So for us, I was like, hey, here's my leave schedule for the next 18 months. And, here's when I'm not going to be here, and I'll be here for holidays. I'll be here for all the other stuff because I wanted to be able to manage the other thing. And what David said was exactly right. He goes, the things that you're going to learn in business school are directly applicable to you as a battalion commander in recruiting battalion, because it's very much like running a business. And because you have a marketing team, you have all these things that you don't normally have in the military. So what I did is I took what they call as a Monday morning dividend, and I would come back and on Monday mornings really engage my CSM, he was going through an MBA program himself. And we would talk about what we needed to do to get our battalion out of 32 out of 42 battalions and see if we could do better. We overachieved. And for the first 16 months I was in command, we were number 1 out of 42 battalions, and in a very big battalion in Los Angeles that had never really been higher than, say, mid 25s. So it was great.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
And we
awesome.
worked with the mayor and a lot of other people that I think had I not gone to business school, I wouldn't have realized these are the people I needed to knock on the doors.
Yeah, I think there's two lessons learned there. One is your network is your net worth, which we talk about,
Yep.
when you have
Absolutely.
that person. And then number two, as General Patton used to say, a lot of people talk about loyalty and they think about loyalty from the bottom up. More rare you see loyalty from the top down, by, publishing things like, hey, this is what I'm going to leave, communicating that to your, up and down the chain. But I think a lot of folks, when we transition, we tell these great troops that are in active service or military spouses that are, going to transition that, our Army, the military, it's like Fortune 2 size company, right? And so every year that recruitment goal is so incredibly important. We hire 120,000 young Americans every year that join our ranks. So, when you have recruiting battalions like you ran, to go to be number one is phenomenal. Hey, Patrick, we got to end it there. So I'm sorry, man. This has been awesome about learning about, acquisition and ownership through acquisition specifically and owners in honor. Thank you for your service to our country. Thank you for your continued service and living that purpose-driven life.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Dan. And thanks to all the veterans that are watching the show.
Yeah. All right, listen, that's going to wrap up the show, Warrior Money. You can check out our podcast wherever you get your podcasts or find us at Yahoo Finance. I'm Patrick Murphy.
And I'm Dan Coons. We'll see you again next week.
This content was not intended to be financial advice and should not be used as a substitute for professional financial services.